All right, looks like it's 1 o'clock on the dot, so let's go ahead and get started. Hi everyone, my name is Nicole Wooten. I work with the Hudson Highlands Land Trust, and you all are in for a treat today. So we're going to be talking about amphibians. So I will go ahead and share my screen so we can get started. So this webinar today is all about amphibians. Like I said, my name is Nicole Wooten. I'm the Natural Resources Manager at the Hudson Highlands Land Trust. And the Hudson Highlands Land Trust is a regional nonprofit conservation organization that protects the natural resources and scenic beauty of the Hudson Highlands region in New York. And I am joined today by Laura Heedy, who's the Conservation and Land Use Program Coordinator at the Department for Environmental Conservation, Hudson River Estuary Program, and Cornell University. And for today's webinar, we will be talking all about amphibians. We'll be focusing on forest amphibians, and Laura will teach us all about vernal pool habitats. She'll also talk about why connected forests are so important, especially for big night migration events. If you don't know what a big night is, we'll be explaining that too. Laura will also introduce the Amphibian Migration and Road Crossings Program. And then I'll go ahead and talk about a volunteer story, my personal story from volunteering with this program at March of this year. And then we'll dive into some species spotlights. So what are the species that you can see and hear right now, especially in the Highlands region of New York, but in other areas as well. And then I'll talk about 3 ways that you can get involved if you're interested. So as we go along, please put your questions in the chat box. We'll save time after the presentations for questions. And while you're welcome to have your video on, this will mostly be interaction through the chat box. So please do bring us those questions and we'll be happy to answer. And with that, I will hand it off to Laura.
Great. Thank you so much, Nicole. Good afternoon, everybody. And thank you for, if you were getting to spend time outside, thanks for actually coming in on this beautiful day to join us for the webinar. And thank you to Ashley and Nicole and Julia at the Land Trust and the Hudson Highlands Land Trust for inviting me to talk today and be part of this webinar series. I'm excited because I'll get to talk to you about some of my favorite animals and my favorite habitats. And before we get started, and I switched over to sharing my slides, I just wanted to see if you could all take a moment to think about the last amphibian encounter you had. So what was the last salamander, frog, toad, newt experience you had, and just put the name of the last salamander you saw in the chat box. And while you do that, I'm going to switch over to my slide mode here. Okay, can you all see my slides?
Not yet, Laura.
Yet, Laura.
Oh, weird. Okay. Well, first, let's just take a minute and see. Oh, hold on a minute. Where did that just go off?
There we go.
I'm not sure why I'm seeing many screens right now, but hopefully this works for everyone. Is that good?
We see the PowerPoint. There we go. Perfect.
Okay, great. Okay, so as Nicole said, I'm Laura Heedy, and I'm the Conservation and Land Use Program Coordinator at the DEC's Hudson River Estuary Program through a partnership with Cornell University. If you are not familiar, the Hudson River Estuary Program is a non-regulatory program within the DEC. We're unique within the DEC because we work across 3 different DEC regions, and that's because we take an ecosystem-based approach So we're focusing not only on the Hudson River estuary, that portion of the Hudson River, but also the surrounding watershed. And that watershed includes the lands and water bodies that drain into the estuary, and that includes the forests and woodland pool habitats we're going to be talking about today. So I'm the team leader for our conservation and land use team, and together with my colleagues Ingrid Hakel and Nate Nardi-Cyrus, we actually work with municipalities and with land trusts in the watershed to provide training and biological data and planning tools and assistance to help those partners conserve priority natural areas in the watershed. So forests and wetlands are two important components of any watershed. You know, they provide clean water and clean air and important habitat and climate adaptation. But today we're going to take a deep dive into what is a woodland pool and talk about woodland pools. So you may have heard different terms for the phrase woodland pool, perhaps vernal pool, which is specifically talking about these wetlands that fill up in the spring, but also spring pool for that same reason. Maybe you've heard the more technical term, probably from some legislation, a seasonally ponded, isolated wetland, which is very explicit. Down south, people refer to them as hog wallows, and in Massachusetts, wicked big puddles. And they're often kind of considered the underdogs of the wetland world. I mean, we're looking at a photo here of a woodland pool, and as you can see, it just does look like a wicked big puddle in the woods, and for that reason, they're often overlooked or underappreciated, and so they're kind of the underdogs compared to other wetlands. And also for that reason, they may be referred to as disappearing ponds. So they disappear because they dry up every year, but also they're disappearing their value, and an unknowing landowner might decide to take down the trees and turn it into a pond, which would have less habitat value, much less habitat value than a woodland pond, or somebody might think it's not important and fill it. So for that reason, they're also disappearing. So we're going to talk about ways to hopefully prevent that. So what makes a woodland pool different from other wetland types? There's so many different kinds of wetlands. And so I wanted to take some time to look at their characteristics. So first of all, woodland pools are small. They're usually only about an acre or two in size, sometimes smaller, sometimes larger. And they sit in a small basin or a little depression, like you can see in this photo, where it's kind of surrounded by upland that's a little bit higher topographically. So it's kind of like a little watershed in that it captures the stormwater, the snowmelt, the rainfall that falls into that surrounding little watershed and drains down into the pool. And sometimes they're also filled by a rising water table from groundwater. They're surrounded by forest. And again, so I like that term woodland pool because I'm referring to a type of vernal pool that's in the forest. And that's important because the species of amphibians we're going to talk about that breed in these pools, they actually live in the forest. But the other reason it's important is because all of those trees that surround the pool, when they drop their leaves into the water, that's basically the beginning of a really important food web. And the energy that was originally deposited as leaves in the bottom of the pool ends up leaving the pool as salamanders and frogs, which is pretty amazing. Also important to know, woodland pools are shallow. They may generally be about 1 meter or 3 feet in depth. They're also what we call isolated, meaning that they don't usually have a stream flowing in or out. And so, as I said, water collects in the pools from rainfall, from like surface water runoff and snowmelt, but there's not a steady stream flowing in and providing a constant source of water. And so as a result of being shallow and isolated, they have a cycle of holding water, but then also drying out. So this pair of images here is the same woodland pool. I don't know if you, I'm hoping you can see my mouse. This rock outcrop here is the same rock outcrop here on the right-hand photo toward the back. And so this pool, this was actually a very dry spring. It had receded quite a bit well before summertime when it would normally dry out. And that's, I think, because it was kind of a small, shallow pool in the first place. But yeah, so these pools are usually more typically would be completely dry by summer and into early fall. And so between the time the ice starts to melt from the surface of the pool and the time the pool dries up, there's this temporary abundance of water. And the fact that they don't hold water year round means they can't support, are you guessing in your mind what they can't support? Fish. And so by being predator free, it makes the pools excellent breeding habitat, excellent nursery habitat for amphibians as their eggs and larvae and tadpoles develop. And they're also really important habitat for a whole host of different invertebrate species like fingernail clams and lots of different kinds of aquatic insects. And as you can imagine, they're also an important water source for a lot of other wildlife that's in the forest. So that brings us to wildlife. So returning to that original question, what makes a woodland pool different from other wetland types? I like to also pose a question. We also should think about who makes a woodland pool different from other wetland types, because woodland pools are often defined by who is breeding there or what is breeding there. And actually in states and municipalities that have regulations to protect vernal pools, they often rely on documenting what is breeding there in order to classify them as a woodland pool. So again, that idea of not having fish predators to eat the eggs and tadpoles and larvae, the woodland pools are critical breeding habitat for this group of amphibians that live in the forest. And they're of conservation concern throughout the Northeast. And in the Hudson Estuary watershed, there's 4 key species that rely specifically on woodland pools for breeding. And so this includes the wood frog, which is on the lower right. And wood frog is probably a species that you have heard or seen. Wood frog males probably in the Hudson Highlands would be maybe around this year, late February, early to mid-March. You would hear the males making their quacking sound, which is very distinguished it's very distinct about wood frogs. They really sound like ducks, and the males are calling to lure the females to the pools. And you also might see wood frogs hopping, on the forest floor in other times of year. The other 3 species are a little bit more elusive and hard to see. So this are called mole salamanders because they spend most of their time underground, like a mole. They spend time in the burrows of small mammals, in the channels created by tree roots, under rocks and rotting logs, and they're pretty much nocturnal. So the chances of seeing them during most of the year is slim. And so these 3 species include, up in the upper left corner is the spotted salamander. In the lower left corner is the hybrid that we refer to as the Jefferson blue-spotted salamander complex. So those are two species that hybridize so much that we don't really try to even distinguish them in the field just through observation visually. And then the other species in the upper right corner, which looks like it's about to pop, it's so plump, is a marbled salamander. And marbled salamander is different from these other 3 species in that it breeds in the fall. But this group of species together are really what we would consider obligate woodland pool species. That's really their preferred habitat where they would breed. So the one time of year that you have a chance to see more of these, particularly the salamanders, as well as the wood frog, above ground and moving, is when they migrate from their forest home to woodland pools for breeding. And again, they do that in late winter, early spring, depending on the year. It's very variable depending on how warm things get earlier in the year. And then again, when they're done breeding, they might hang out at the pools or the pool area for a couple of weeks. They then return to the forest. And the juveniles also need to survive that journey back. Once they develop legs and leave the pools, they also have to go back to the forest. So there's a lot of movement. And when Nicole made mention about connectivity, having the ability to move safely from the forest to the woodland pools and back is really a key for their survival. So let's talk a little bit about the juveniles that really, they need to survive. The egg masses have to hatch, they have to survive as larvae and then develop before they leave. And so that takes, maybe a couple of months. And in this photo, this is a spotted salamander egg mass on the left. And sadly, I found that egg mass lying out in dry leaves when it was left kind of high and dry by a pool that started receding early due to a dry spring. But it's a really nice image to be able to see what they look like. They very typically are the shape of kind of a kidney. They're a very tight cluster of eggs, and sometimes they're clear, and sometimes you may see them opaque white, and that's totally normal. And later on, as they're developing, they might take on a green hue from algae growing in the egg mass. And then here are images of the developing salamander larvae. And to be able to distinguish the different species in their larvae is very challenging unless you're an expert, which I'm not. However, what I wanted to point out to you is that these external gills, these fun little fringy kind of appendices on their heads, those are unique to the salamander larvae. Frog tadpoles have internal gills, so you wouldn't see that. And so if you're in a pool environment and you see both external and internal gills, then you know you have both salamander and frogs developing, and you might be able to kind of narrow down what you have based on that. And so then I also wanted to point out what the wood frog eggs and tadpoles look like. And so here, this was a great photo taken by one of our volunteers up in Rensselaer County. This is an adult wood frog hanging out on the water surface by egg masses. And wood frogs typically lay their eggs close together, and this results in what is called a raft, where you have a raft of many different egg masses all together near the surface of the water. And the same day I spotted that salamander egg mass out of the water, I also found this wood frog egg mass out of the water. It's kind of starting to desiccate here, but I thought it was a cool image because you can actually see those individual little embryos all developing and starting to get different appendages as they develop. I also wanted to show you an example of the tadpole. So here you can see the difference. This tadpole does not have the external gills. And so this is a wood frog tadpole. And if I can get this to play okay on my unstable internet connection, here they are quite active later in the season when they start getting larger. And I usually carry around some kind of white container in my backpack so that I can put them in water and take a look at them close up and maybe take a photo. And also just to keep in the spirit of the Hudson Highlands theme of bringing nature to you, I just wanted to take a couple minutes to maybe help you learn how to identify these kind of three most common egg masses you might encounter in a woodland pool. One important thing to think about is, so when I collected these three egg masses, it was on the same day. So I'm able to kind of use timing to think about how far along they are in development in comparison to each other. So the two salamander egg masses on the left and in the center, I know that Jefferson blue-spotted salamanders usually migrate a little bit earlier to the pools and start the breeding process earlier. So you can see this egg mass is further developed in this one, where the embryos are still tight little spheres, but here we're starting to see actual growth. So to me, if I was looking at these two egg masses, I could deduce that this one on the in the middle is Jefferson blue because they probably got to the pool ahead of the spotted salamanders. Another reason why is because of their hybridization, they often have unviable eggs within the same egg mass as viable eggs. So we can see some of them here are dead and not developing, and that's a good indicator of Jefferson blue-spotted salamanders. If we were able to pick them up, we would also be able to feel that the spotted salamander egg mass is a very tight cluster, and it's much firmer. And the Jefferson blue-spotted salamander egg, and also the way they're deposited. Jefferson blue-spotted salamanders usually deposit their eggs along twigs in a way that's sometimes described as kind of a sausage shaped or like a necklace wrapped around the twig, whereas spotted salamanders are often attached to a twig or vegetation, but not necessarily around the twigs quite as much. So those are the ways to distinguish those two more frequent pool breeding salamanders. And then also the same time of year, again, are the wood frog eggs, which their egg masses often have many more eggs within the egg mass. And they're also, they lack there's like this clear coating around, that protective kind of gel coating around the egg mass in the salamanders. That's missing in wood frog eggs. So you really can get a sense of, you can see the eggs really clearly right at the surface of the egg mass. And again, there's a lot more. So hopefully that'll help you kind of, navigate the way you identify eggs if you're ever visiting a pool. As you can imagine, with all of those eggs and tadpoles and larvae, while they're not being preyed upon by fish, they're an extremely nutritious food source for other species like wading birds, snakes, and turtles, for example, like the spotted turtle. Spotted turtles and other semi-aquatic turtles, especially this time of year, and you may have already started seeing, turtles like painted turtle and snapping turtle out on roads. This is like the beginning. I always think of Memorial Day weekend as prime time breeding for our semi-aquatic turtles in the Hudson Valley. And for something like a spotted turtle that's left its core wetland to find a mate and for the females to lay eggs in upland areas, stopping over at a woodland pool that's full of tadpoles and egg masses, it's like us stopping at a rest stop and getting a little bit of, food. So it's a good chance for them to kind of get shelter on their way of moving across land, but also to feed. And I also mentioned that pools support great vertebrate diversity, and I wanted to play a video of this really amazing little crustacean. A freshwater crustacean that is really dependent on the intermittent nature of woodland pools. They spend their whole short lives in pools, but their eggs require a period of drying out and freezing before they can hatch. So it's a very interesting life history, and without that cycle of inundation and drying, fairy shrimp would not exist. So really cool, just wanted to point them out. And they're usually there much earlier in the season, like when the ice first starts to melt, you'll often see fairy shrimp. Okay, so let's review. What is a woodland pool? It's a seasonally flooded wetland in the forest that is typically small, just 1 or 2 acres. It's shallow, only maybe 1 meter deep. They sit in an isolated basin and have no inlet or outlet, and therefore they often dry up in summer, and they're free of fish. And I did want to point out, this photo in the center is actually in the Hudson Highlands. This was a group of volunteers from the towns of Cortland and Putnam Valley, I'm going to guess about 18, 19 years ago, I think, when we did some habitat mapping together in the Hudson Highlands. And that pool, we could have easily walked right through the woods, never realized that it was a pool, but we looked for certain indicators that helped us recognize that it was indeed a woodland pool. And then again, what's special about woodland pools is that they do provide critical habitat for breeding amphibians. And here's another close-up shot of wood frog eggs. So I wanted to take a few minutes to talk about how we can make sure that woodland pools and amphibians are here for many years to come in the Hudson Highlands and throughout their range in the Hudson River Estuary watershed in New York. Around the world, if you're reading conservation news, you're probably aware that amphibians as a group face many threats. Some of them are outside of really our individual sphere of influence on what we can change, but there are 3 kind of key conservation concerns and challenges that I wanted to talk about today. The first is habitat loss and degradation. The habitats that these amphibians use, forests throughout the year and these small wetlands, woodland pools during the rest of the year, they're relatively unprotected. You may not be aware of the regulations, but in New York State, the DEC is only authorized to protect wetlands that are 12.4 acres and larger. And as you know now, small, woodland pools are very small. And they're often too isolated to meet the criteria for protection by federal regulations. So they're very vulnerable, and similarly forests generally don't have any special protection. Another concern that we have about woodland pool breeding amphibians is climate change. So, climate change, we're already seeing this now, and the predictions for the future include more erratic weather, including things like intense storms. We've seen situations where it gets really warm in like late February, and then we see a nor'easter in March. And this is probably confusing to some of these amphibians that are using cues like thawing ground to know when it's warm enough for them to leave their winter shelter and start moving to pools for breeding. Similarly, the lack of snowpack, especially this year, was a good example of that, but the prediction is that we'll have less and less snowpack in the winter. So that means less water melting or less meltwater entering the pools. And similarly, drought in the summer may impact how long these pools are holding water and whether there's a long enough hydro period for successful breeding. Another concern about amphibians in general is road mortality. So habitat fragmentation, when we kind of sever the connections between forests and woodland pools from development and other causes, it forces these migrating amphibians to cross roads and development where they can be particularly vulnerable to vehicles and other threats. So I wanted to help you visualize kind of this issue of road mortality. And so take a minute to kind of think about and consider the migration. Generally, it occurs on the first few rainy nights in late winter, early spring, after the ground has thawed, again, when evening temperatures are at least 40 degrees Fahrenheit. So generally, there's a kind of a period of time, when all the conditions line up just right. There can be what we consider an explosive migration, where hundreds, if not thousands, of amphibians are coming out, like the salamanders are leaving their overwintering sites underground. The wood frogs, which have been pretty much frozen all winter in the leaf litter, defrost, and they all move from the forest to these pools. And I like to note that this is not drawn to scale, but this hopefully gives you an idea of what that explosive migration looks like. And people will refer to this as a big night when all these conditions line up. But it's the fact that all of these amphibians might be all out on the same night and vulnerable on roads that makes them particularly vulnerable in terms of like local population extinctions. Because if there's a lot of mortality happening in particular locations from road crossings, it could eventually over time start to wipe out a local population. Thanks to the conservation in land trusts like Hudson Highlands Land Trust and landowners, some migrations are happening deep in the forest without any, risks, where the only threats really are predators like raccoons and snakes. But often, in reality, there are roads that are severing these habitat connections. And these small animals that are very cold, that have basically just woken up from the winter, need to slowly move across these roads and long driveways on their ways to the pools and back to the forest. And research has shown that even low trafficked roads can have significant mortality. And I've seen this myself while I'm out helping migrating amphibians. And here's an example of a spotted salamander and a wood frog out on the road. And you can see that little wood frog's front feet are kind of flipped under. And that's how I see a lot of them, because they've really just started to kind of rehydrate and unfreeze, and their bodies were curled up kind of all winter. So it's a reminder of what amazing things they're doing in order to successfully breed. And so it breaks my heart that something can do. So let's think about the distances they travel to help you really appreciate the amount of habitat they need. There's been a lot of research in different states looking at the distance that different species travel. And so these numbers don't all jive, but I think the take-home message is we're still learning, from all these different studies, how far some of them travel. But the bottom line really is that they do travel significantly long distances, and we need to think about that and proactively consider it when siting new developments or designing conservation strategies. You can see, some of these data suggest that Jefferson salamander, wood frog, they'll travel up to almost like half a mile. And, if you're a 7-inch salamander, that's a long way to travel. So making sure they have safe kind of green corridors, as the land trust may say, will be really important in the future. So thinking about solutions and opportunities. Oh, it seems like there's an emergency happening in my neighborhood, so I apologize if you can hear the fire engines. Along with education, which is so important, so I'm hoping you'll all leave the webinar today and spread the word. But you know, the ideal is to conserve clusters of woodland pools in large intact forests. That's the kind of ideal large scale approach, because that enables there to be good habitat connectivity. It also provides for a cluster of pools that if climate change starts impacting the viability of some pools as breeding habitat, hopefully there's something else really close by, because these salamanders and frogs do return to the pools that they hatched out of themselves. But this can you know, be achieved through coordinated connectivity plan, like what the Land Trust is doing in the Hudson Highlands, working, you know, decisions that are pretty uncoordinated about land use. So trying to be more coordinated in thinking about large forests and habitat connectivity. Many municipalities are focusing on local mapping, like natural resource inventories, but also even vernal pool mapping projects, developing conservation strategies like open space plans, or even local wetland policies that will protect vernal pools that are otherwise unprotected. Also working with landowners on good stewardship of their vernal pools and designing new site proposals in a way that have low impacts to woodland pools. So these will kind of help directly address these concerns about habitat loss and climate change, and hopefully through raising awareness will start to also indirectly improve the issues related to road mortality. I did want to just make the point that while a large scale approach is best, there are times we have to think about conserving enough forests just around an individual woodland pool. And I wanted to let you know there are resources that have planning guidance on this, ranging back to around 2002, when there was some guidance that looked at the need or suggested a circular buffer around pools of about 750 feet, which could withstand about 25% development or unforested area and still keep that local population viable. And then more recently, Aaron Calhoun from University of Maine started looking at the idea of more directional buffers, which require actually knowing a little bit about what the amphibians are doing and how they're moving. But she was finding that if there was some understanding of where they were moving from and to, that can help maybe develop buffer areas that are more focused on the habitat they're using. So anyway, so, you know, again, lots to learn, that we're still learning about wildlife, but also a reminder that it's not just about protecting the pool, it's about protecting the critical upland habitat as well. And then to address road mortality, there's the opportunity, again, as Nicole already alluded to, volunteer to help with road crossings. And once we have enough data about where high mortality is, maybe temporarily close a road, or maybe, you know, in a really well-known high mortality area, explore the idea of investing in some kind of under road passage. And those can address road mortality and also maybe bring light to where areas of habitat conservation are needed. And so to close, I did want to point out that to help address this road mortality, but also raise awareness, improve understanding of migrations in the watershed, and inform conservation actions, back in 2009, I started the Amphibian Migrations and Road Crossings Project. And it's a, you know, it's a partnership project with the Estuary Program and the DEC and Cornell. And it involves getting volunteers throughout the estuary watershed out surveying roads to find where these high-risk migration pathways are, because the estuary watershed is huge and there's many, many miles of roads, and nobody had a database of where these locations were. So thanks to the eyes of volunteers, we're starting to be able to map some of those places. And when the volunteers are out, they record weather and traffic conditions, they document the species and numbers of amphibians they're seeing, and they help move them across safely. And anyone can participate. There's a lot of resources on our website, at the DEC website. Volunteer training presentations are on YouTube. We have a handbook, video, and lots of other materials. And most volunteers are actually self-taught, and they'll go out after kind of training themselves. They'll go with a friend or a spouse or small group. But I'm also now more recently starting to partner with different organizations to help them coordinate local volunteer groups. And so I'm going to stop there because I know that Nicole, thank you very much, volunteered this year and was going to share her experience with how that went, and then talk more about amphibians in the Hudson Highlands.
All right, thank you so much, Laura.
Yes, you're welcome.
Sure, so let's dive in here. Sorry, my screen is being a little bit slow on me. And I'm going to, as Laura said, talk about the experience of being a volunteer with the Amphibian Migration and Road Crossings program. So can you all see my screen that says Amphibian Migration Road Crossing?
Yes, we can.
Great, thank you. I'll also do a couple species spotlights and talk about different ways that you can get involved. So let's dive in. So a lot of folks ask, what is it like to do the Amphibian Migration and Road Crossing program? And Hudson Highlands Land Trust just started coordinating volunteers with this program last year. And the general response is, it's moving. And I don't just say that because it's a migration event that helps frogs and salamanders cross the road, and toads. But picture yourself in the chilly, dark hours at the tail end of winter, witnessing this incredible pulse of life. It happens every single year, and most people don't even know it happens. So while it is sad to see the roadkill that is a part of the experience, it is amazing to witness this pulse of life and to help these amphibians at this very vulnerable stage in their lives move forward, and in turn help our entire ecosystem. So it's an incredible experience. The next question usually is, well, can I do it? And as Laura said, there is plenty of information out there. I do want to mention that, yeah, it's cold and it's wet, and when you're working, you're usually working near a road. So if it's up to you if that's an okay setting, but if you're ready for a little uncomfortable but very inspiring adventure, then I will give you a little story of how it went for my crew this year. And then we'll also talk about how to prep your gear and remember to be flexible as possible in your evening schedule for a couple of weeks. And so important to record your results. We had a question already in the chat box about how to map hotspots for amphibian migration. Well, this is the best program around. And I'll mention another one at the end too, but let's dive right in. So the Hudson Highlands Land Trust story, earlier this year, I was in an email group with about 20 people around Phillipstown and Putnam Valley who were interested in experiencing a big night and helping out. So as we got closer to the right conditions, folks started checking on the roads that they thought may be ripe for amphibian migration, areas they may have seen frogs cross the road before. And some folks who weren't as familiar with looking for these resources wanted to know how they could identify potential crossing sites. So I just wanted to mention these few resources. On the left is the Hudson Valley Natural Resource Mapper with a bunch of layers that I added on there of streams and wetland complexes. So that is a great free resource online. We will share the link to that. On the right, you can see a natural resource inventory that was done by Putnam Valley. And that took all of this information and put it specifically in their municipality with some good landmarks. So it's an incredible resource. And if your town has one, please do look it up. If it doesn't, maybe it'd be a good time to make one. And in the middle, you can see Google satellite imagery. It's also a great go-to option as long as you start to get used to what to look for. So for the night itself, we had a big false alarm. So this on Monday, March 9th, we had a 100% chance of rain, but there was no actual rain. So the photos you're seeing now are from Tuesday, March 10th. On Tuesday, there was no rain predicted, but we got a sudden downpour that made for the perfect conditions. It was enough to make the grounds and the roads soggy wet. So I was inside at a restaurant at the time, but a friend called me and another volunteer was with me. We left immediately. We left our drinks and food and ran outside at about 9:30, 10 at night to a designated meeting place that we had to look for amphibians. So just a reminder that good times to look are the first really rainy night after the ground has thawed. So you want about 3 nights at 40 degrees or warmer at night. And remember that this can be unexpected. Nature doesn't follow the weather report. But fortunately, out of our team of 24 people, we were able to gather together at 10 o'clock at night to help the amphibians cross. And we had over 150 amphibians that we did help cross. About half that number we did find as roadkill too. So I'm glad we were able to get out there and make a difference. And a few tips, if you are planning on volunteering, do make sure that your hands are clean and wet. Amphibians can breathe through their skin. So you want to make sure that they are still comfortable as you're helping them across the road. We always put them in the direction that they're headed. And someone did bring a spatula and a bucket too, which were helpful at times. But generally, we just walked back and forth on this half-mile section of road, and these amphibians were not that hard to catch because they were very cold at the time. And that's often why they get hit by cars, is they can't jump away quickly enough. So here's our results. As you can see, we had 100 spring peepers and quite a few other species. And I put in bold at the bottom 1 wood frog and 1 spotted salamander. And you can see the spotted salamander in the bucket there. Those 2 are obligate vernal pool species. So we knew that there must be a vernal pool nearby because these species only breed in vernal pools. So here's a little species spotlight for you. This is a spring peeper. This was the most common find for our night. They are fairly easy to identify. One, because they're the most iconic noise for springtime. They make that high-pitched peep, peep, peep noise. If we have time, we'll listen to a recording. And they have an X mark on their back. So their scientific name, Pseudocris crucifer, the final point there, crucifer, actually means cross bearer. So they have this cross on their back. They have smooth skin, light brown to gray to olive, and smaller toe pads than you'd find on a tree frog. And here was our second most common find, a green frog. These are easily identified by the large circles behind their eyes. Those are known as tympanum organs. They're hearing organs. Bullfrogs also have those tympanum, but they lack the ridges that you can see going about 2/3 back from the eye, 2/3 back on the body of the green frog. So I'm going to take a second here and play a sound from our from a great resource. This is Music of Nature, and it has some calls of frogs and toads in the Northeast. And here is the sound of the peeper. So as you can hear, it's a high-pitched peeping noise, pretty constant. From far away, it can sound like jingling sleigh bells. And for our green frog, scroll down here for you. This is one of my favorite calls. That sounds like a loosely plucked banjo string. Fortunately, it's not playing here for you right now, but I'll share that link in the chat box and play it at home. Let me hop back in to our PowerPoint. So let's see. All right, gear. So the Amphibian Migration Road Crossing Program made this handy dandy list on the left of what you should bring. And Laura already covered some of these, but I do want to emphasize those guides, the Amphibian Migration Road Crossing identification guides, are fantastic. And I highly recommend bringing one, putting it in a clear binder cover or paper cover you might put in a binder just to keep it dry because you will be out there in the rain. So definitely bring your raincoat, bring something reflective because you will be near the road, near cars, and also dress in layers. It might be around 40 degrees while you're out there, so good to stay comfortable. Also with the flashlight, I love to bring a headlamp. Keeps my hands free for picking up frogs. And it's good to bring a couple if you're going to be out there for a while. And then also something to write on, either that's waterproof, like a Write in the Rain notebook, or an umbrella and a notebook to record your results. So right now, what can you hear? This is a pretty handy calendar of frog calls and toad calls from SUNY Environmental School and Environmental Science and Forestry. And this is sort of generalized across the state, so you may not see this specifically in your region. But what I will point out is that the American toad and the gray tree frog have been reported in our area, actually by 2 Hudson Highlands Land Trust board members, Lou Kingsley and Ann Sims, mentioned hearing them recently this past weekend. So let's take a look. On the left, you can see that American toad, and they have rough skin. The colors can vary from light brown to red brown. They have 1 to 2 warts on the dark spots on their back. You may know Fowler's toad is a similar species, but it has 3 to 7 warts or bumps in those black spots on its back. And another species here is the eastern red newt. This one you won't hear, but you may see. It is one of the most vibrant species you can find out in the woods. And it's juvenile eft stage, its terrestrial stage, where it's a rebellious teenager. It leaves the water and goes out on land. They can grow up to 3 inches long, and they have 2 rows of spots with black borders on their back, which they can actually retain into their adult aquatic stage. And we've got a little inset picture on the bottom right. That's actually the larval stage. And for a couple of other species, I mentioned the gray tree frog previously. Those are, they also do a trilling noise. The American toad does a low-pitched trill. These do a high-pitched trill. And you may hear them often, but you often won't see them. They can actually camouflage themselves anywhere from light green to a dark gray to match whatever surface they're on, just like a chameleon. So pretty cool. And one final bonus species I have here on the right is a northern cricket frog. These are an endangered species in New York, so you probably won't hear them out there, but if you do, please do report it. And I've heard that they sound like 2 pebbles tapping together, getting faster and faster for 30 seconds. So almost like a cricket call, which is where they get their name. So how to get involved, we already mentioned at the bottom of the screen the Amphibian Migration Road Crossing project, and there's a link for that. There's also Frog Watch USA if you want to experience something that links you with other community scientists across the United States, then you can join in the Frog Watch. They have a specific protocol that they follow for how long to listen and how to catch the intensity of the calls that you hear. And finally, there's also iNaturalist. If you are just a casual frog or salamander or toad observer and you take a photo and you want help with the identification, load it up to iNaturalist, and that will help you find out what it is and help contribute to scientific data. And Hudson Highlands Land Trust has a Nature Time video on iNaturalist all about how to use it, as well as a recent webinar. So if you go down to that link at the bottom of the page here, hhlt.org, that will bring you to some of these resources. You can also see that we have some footage of a wood frog from earlier this year, in a vernal pool, and some egg masses as well. So if you're interested in joining in the amphibian migration and road crossing program, please do talk to your local land trust. There's a Find a Land Trust link right there. And you may be able to join an informal or formal group of other folks who are like-minded, and if not, maybe you can start one. And yeah, I think one final thing I want to leave y'all with, and that Laura alluded to, is our green corridors look. So Hudson Highlands Land Trust really looks at the not just saving one island of green space, but trying to connect everything across the landscape. So animals like amphibians have a place to move and spread their genes and really thrive. So if you'd like to learn more about that, we have information under our New York Highlands Network page on our website to learn more. So with that, I would like to open it up for questions. And I see that we have quite a few in the chat box. Julia, are there any big questions that you would offer that we should answer first, or should we just dive right in?
There was a good question that either you or Laura might be able to answer regarding how amphibians might adapt to climate change, or whether they will.
Good question.
Well, I forgot to preface my talk with saying that I'm not a herpetologist. And I saw there was actually a question asking, like, what did I study, or what was my training? I have a master's in biology, and I studied mammals in the desert of Idaho. But I came back to New York and started working with landing turtles, and that led to just loving wetlands and loving woodland pools in particular when they were introduced to me. So I haven't done research on amphibians, but my feeling is that you know, through natural selection, you know, I always say this, like, you know, there'll be some individuals that maybe are a little adventurous and leave their winter shelters a little too early, and maybe they end up getting frozen because of a freak storm, and they get, you know, selected out of the population. And those sorts of kind of, you know, evolutionary time changes hopefully will somewhat match as conditions start changing due to climate change, where maybe they'll start to adjust to maybe a shorter hydro period. And in fact, there's been research that's shown that when pool levels start dropping and oxygen levels start changing, sometimes that triggers more rapid development of the larvae, so that if they have those abilities already, then perhaps they'll also be able to adjust to you know, maybe starting migration earlier because temperatures are warming earlier. I just hope that the warming temperatures and the precipitation line up in a way that when they leave their winter shelters, they actually get to pools that are holding water and that have water long enough. So I definitely think they're an extremely potentially sensitive group of wildlife when it comes to climate change. And that's why I think anything we can do to conserve habitat now is really important.
Yes, and I would agree with all of that, and just add that Hudson Highlands Land Trust, that's one of our missions, is to conserve these special places. We don't know exactly what will happen with all of these species as the climate changes. We can't predict everything, so we think about saving the stage and protecting areas that are more resilient for climate change, so that the amphibians will have a little more wiggle room.
Great.
To adapt.
I also saw, if you don't mind me jumping in, Julia, I saw there were a couple of questions about how to try to find migration locations and also how to learn how to identify amphibians. And I feel like Nicole touched upon this, but I just want to reiterate, I put a link in the comments or the chat. We have this series of 5 volunteer training presentations that have been recorded. And one of them is specifically about how to find or predict where crossings might be and how to use different map resources online to do that. And one of them is specifically about identifying amphibians. And my colleague, former intern, Emma Clements, recorded that one for me. But there's a lot of more information that we were able to pack into this 1-hour webinar today in those presentations.
And I've added that link to the chat box direct to the
Great.
YouTube, the 5 tutorials.
And I did too as well, up about 20 comments, I think.
Great. Nicole, we had another question that might be good for you. Someone asked about potentially using red filters for lights while helping with the migration.
Sure. Yeah, good question. I actually bought a headlamp specific for that that has a red light. Red lights, if you don't know, help save your night vision. So you can still use a bright light, but you can see well at night. It's not required. If you want to retrofit your flashlight with a red gel filter and you can get your hands on one, great. You can also just use a regular flashlight, maybe on a lower light setting if possible.
And I'll just emphasize that I know, like, when we were monitoring nesting Blanding's turtles, we used red light not to disturb them. With the situation with the amphibians, I don't know of any of the other crossing programs throughout the Northeast, any practitioners that are recommending red filters as a way to protect or not like startle the amphibians, because it's such a fast, quick interaction that you have with them. The really important thing is that you are visible on the road. So you want to be as bright as possible with your headlamp, but you also want a really strong flashlight so you can see what's on the road and not step on what you're trying to save. So visibility of both you for your own safety and visibility of what's going on the road is like really important. And I've gone out with, very stupidly, with a failing battery, and it was really difficult to see with a dull light. So that's why I always recommend bringing extra batteries with you in case that happens while you're on the road.
That's a good call. And while we're on the topic, do either of you have good suggestions for either safely slowing down traffic or just making sure that you're being safe while helping with the crossings?
Sure, I'd say there's no slowing down traffic for the most part, but if you want to start that conversation with your municipal leader, so talk to your town supervisor or your city mayor and talk about how important this is. Find data to back up that you are seeing big migration events in certain areas. And I have heard of some towns being open to closures of roads for temporary measures at certain times of night. But again, it's difficult because it's an unexpected time. Can't always predict exactly when it happens.
Yeah, and I would just second that. That's part of, and that's actually a big goal. I'm hoping at some point, if things slow down because of COVID, right now work is not slowing down, but I'm hoping if it does, I'm finally going to have time to really sink my teeth in the years of data that we have. We don't necessarily have, with the exception of some communities that have been repeatedly going to the same place, we don't always necessarily have many years of data from the same location, but that's actually what will help build a case for temporary road closures. And it was in Keene, New Hampshire, that the Harris Center for Conservation has been able to engage volunteers and was able to put enough documentation of good data together to get the city of Keene in New Hampshire to actually agree to close a road. And that, if that's something of interest, we're actually hoping to put together some guidance on that, because that opened up a whole slew of unexpected challenges, like where people were just showing up, not really knowing about how to handle amphibians safely, not recognizing that they shouldn't be interfering because the road was closed, and they really needed somebody there to help kind of interpret what was happening. So that required staff time. So there's a lot of considerations, not to mention the DPW, I think, stopped working at 3 p.m. every day. So they would need to decide if the road was closing maybe by 11 in the morning. But as anybody knows who's trying to predict the migration, you often don't know if it's really going to be happening until, like, you know, around 6 o'clock at night. So, so there's a lot of challenges, but I think, again, the more good data that we have and the more we understand the timing of the migrations, the better we can predict when to close roads and interfere in other ways, like having maybe volunteer groups like adopt a stretch of road. But in terms of being safe, I would just say, we always say don't interfere with traffic. I bring fact sheets with me that I keep in my car, and if somebody really wants to know what's going on, I share a fact sheet, because a lot of people are actually delighted to find out that there's these lovely polka-dotted salamanders walking across the road, and they maybe actually want to help. And this year I was in a new spot, and a woman stopped. I gave her a fact sheet. I told her what I was doing. She saw me on her way back from wherever she went, and she let me know she had stopped and also helped move wood frogs across the road. So it's a really great chance to educate people about biodiversity that's happening right in their own yards, literally in their own roads.
Thanks. And I popped that fact sheet in the chat
Oh,
box
awesome.
too.
Thank you.
So I think we are just about at time. So I just want to say thank you all. I know there are so many more questions. I wish we could keep talking about this for hours, but hopefully we'll have more information coming out from Hudson Highlands Land Trust, from DEC. Check out the chat box for more resources. I'll pop a couple more in there. And thank you all so much for spending your afternoon talking about amphibians. Really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
All right, and here's a slew of different sites. I know this might be a lot, but if you want to copy paste, and this webinar, feel free to log out. This will be posted to the Hudson Highlands Land Trust website if you want to review, and we'll try to get these resources up there as well. Take care.